Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Pam Adams, and I'd like to welcome you and thank you all for joining us for the 27th annual meeting of the Friends of Connecticut State Parks. This is our second meeting in 2 dimensions brought to you via Zoom, and hopefully by next year we can safely return to our 3-dimensional world, as we certainly are missing seeing all of you in person. I'd also like to welcome our partners from the DEEP, State Park Director Tom Tyler and Bureau Chief Mike Lambert are with us this evening. And if there are any other folks from the DEEP, I can't see the list at the moment, but you are certainly welcome, and we love having you here tonight. We have a very exciting evening planned with our special guest and keynote speaker, Dr. Nick Bellantoni, Emeritus State Archaeologist, who is often dubbed Connecticut's Indiana Jones, probably much to his dismay. He has a very intriguing program for us about some pretty impressive creatures who used to roam the land that is now Connecticut, and we will hear from him in a short while. On behalf of the Friends of Connecticut State Parks, I would like to express our continuing gratitude to all of you and your organizations for the awesome work you have accomplished throughout these challenging circumstances and times on behalf of our state parks, forest, and recreation areas. You all continue to make positive difference for the residents of Connecticut and our visitors by enhancing their experience through your programs and projects. Your contributions make visits to our outdoor recreational properties deeper and a more memorable experience, and we applaud you all. And now I would like to introduce Friends of Connecticut State Parks co-president, Eileen Grant, who would like to say a few words.
Good evening. I too want to thank all Friends groups and any park staff attending for all your hard work this year. It's been a challenge, I know, to adapt to all the changing health protocols while coping with dramatically increasing numbers of visitors and addressing consequent wear and tear on infrastructure and the landscape. I would like to say that the strains to parks and forests and to our groups in the last couple of years will diminish if and when COVID is finally controlled. But the truth is that we are not likely to let out many collective sighs of relief anytime soon. A different kind of trouble is imminent, which may likely disrupt normal operations at many of our park facilities. It may not be entirely new news to you all, but the park system is facing a possible 40 to 45% loss of staff by July 1st, 2022, due to looming retirements. Such a magnitude of loss, on top of already wholly inadequate levels of personnel, will have major ramifications for the park system and its visitors, obviously, but also could affect the varied enterprises of our Friends groups in negative ways. In the near term, there will be fewer supervisors and maintainers spread over expanding areas of responsibility with whom we will be able to coordinate volunteer activities. Whether we are engaged in maintenance and trail work, educational programming, research, or child-centric and fundraising events, there will likely be less staff to help facilitate our mutually beneficial efforts in traditional manners. Sanitation setups, litter retrieval and cleaning post-events, parking assistance, traffic control, and the provision of security are tasks typically handled by DEEP staff. If personnel levels of full-time workers and seasonals are critically low, DEEP, as much as they might want to help, may not be able to fully support our undertakings to the same historic degree, if that choice means the public would lose vital services in their parks as a consequence. Much of our programming and many of our events have been hosted at our respective parks for decades. It could be difficult initially to make adjustments to our partnership patterns if staff strength heads south next year. FCSP and CFPA certainly intend to push both for quick refills of empty positions and also for long needed increase in the overall number of park staff. As we struggle to accomplish these goals, hopefully with your assistance, we have every faith in the Friends' ability to adapt to the situations on the ground. We don't wish you to harness your ambitions for your parks in any way, however. That would be counterproductive and undercut all the progress we have made to enhance the system. It has been your vision, your collective work, and your steadfast advocacy that have so positively raised the profile and fortunes of parks and forests. Our network must remain robust to garner the resources necessary for proper service to patrons. At the same time, we all should be prepared to recalibrate when we prepare our action plans for the coming seasons. Be realistic about the likely pace of activity with diminished staff. Be ready to fly solo on more frequent occasion. Be sensitive to our overburdened deep partners and pack your patience. Any negative energy that may bubble up due to shifting patterns of interaction can most productively be focused on the true obstructionists, those unfairly withholding the adequate personnel resources necessary to get the job done in parks. We know that despite the obstacles, you'll do all in your power to accomplish wonderful things at your parks and provide the best experiences possible for our millions of visitors. I very much hope to see you in person too next year. Perhaps they'll let us into the Capitol this spring for FCSP Day, or maybe not. Now I'd like to turn things over to Michelle Kiley, our FCSP treasurer, to conduct the business meeting and the election. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Eileen, and good evening to everybody. So I became the interim treasurer around June or July this year. Sally Harold, who was the treasurer, has moved out of state and needed help covering her position. So just a ground rule, since we're not live, little logistics. So when we're voting here, the way we're going to vote is by clicking the raise hand icon down at the bottom. And so let's get started. The first order of business to cover is approval of minutes from the 2020 annual meeting. The document was available in a link on the website. If anybody has a question on the minutes, you can add it to the chat. I'll give about 10, 20 seconds for that to happen. Then we'll take a vote. If you would like to approve the minutes with no questions, you may click raise hand. Okay, and I assume, Eric, you're seeing hand raises. Okay, so give me a signal when you think we've gone. So we're done with the raise hands. We can move on. Okay, great. So the next item to cover is the treasurer's report. And that I can show you by sharing my screen. Hang on one sec. Okay, so here is the treasurer's report being presented for approval. I have to say there is one correction. We have two accounts, checking and savings, and the investment income and interest is understated by $151. So we had a better year than the previous year with revenue of 7505, actually corrected to 7652. And expenditures, our largest expenditure you'll see there is awards and grants to others. And that was actually a payment to help support Connecticut Forest and Park Association. So I am going to stop sharing this. And we'll do the same thing now. Everybody can lower their hand if you didn't previously, and then re-raise your hand for voting to approve the minutes. And again, the chat is available if anybody has a question. And Eric, give me a signal when you think you've gotten enough. Okay. Okay. So the next order of business is nominations. So first I need to ask if there's any nominations from the floor or from the Zoom meeting for any positions. And if there are, use that chat. And I'm going to share my screen with the slate of officers. Okay, well, I'm going to skip sharing screen. The slate of officers was available for download from the website. If anybody has any questions, use that chat. And so we're going to do the vote in two sections. The first is the officers. It would be Eileen Grant as president and Ryan Snide as vice president, Theodore Lynn, AKA Ted, as secretary, and myself as treasurer. And we'll ask for the raise hand again to approve the officers. Okay. And then on to the rest of the board. And that is Margot Burns, Helen Post Curry, Eric Hammerling, host of the meeting from Connecticut Forest and Park, Liz Ann Coos, Christine Coster, Sean Roach, Susan Whalen, Jay Willerup, and these are all current members of the board as well. They are not new. And ex officio, we have Michael Lambert, the DEEP Bureau Chief, and Tom Tyler, Director of the DEEP State Parks Division. So once again, we'll do a raise hand to acknowledge that's the slate. Moving right along. We're doing an awesome job here, moving along. So now I would like to introduce Eric. He is the Director of Connecticut Forest and Park Association. And off to you, Eric.
All right, so I'm seeing a question in the chat, but we will maybe address that as we go. So Pam, do you want to address that right now?
Yeah, I think it was on the list of board members that my name was left off.
Oh, well, if that's the
Right.
case.
Pam, I was typing in the chat there. Pam is stepping down as co-president to just board member.
Right.
Still have her support, just not as an officer.
Very good. Okay, thank you for that clarification. Obviously, it would be a very sad day for all of us if Pam Adams was actually stepping away from the board wholly, but thanks to you, Pam, for your service as our co-president, and congratulations to you, Eileen, for continuing on as our president. It's just an honor to work with both of you. So I wanted to talk about a few things, and this will maybe sound a little bit similar from what you heard from Eileen, but I do want to put a fine point on this issue of resources for Deeps Park Division and some things that I think all of us as representatives of Friends Group are going to have to wrestle with in this next year. So as I join you tonight, many park superintendents and park maintainers are actively planning what they will do when they retire at some point in the next 8 months. I can assure you the collective impact from a massive retirements will have an impact on state parks near you in 2022. So let me start a little bit more broadly than state parks by saying that there are currently about 385 full-time employees at the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection who work on the front lines of managing state parks, state forests, wildlife management areas, and related natural and recreational resources. Over 170 of these 385 resource experts and support staff are expected to retire in the next 8 months, because on July 1st of this next year, pension, health, and related benefits for retiring state employees will change. So there is unfortunately an incentive for state employees to retire, even if they are retiring without being fully eligible for retirement benefits. We've already heard from several folks who are retiring early. Now, I should say, in all fairness, these changes will save Connecticut some money in the future, But in the short term, the management of your state parks, forests, and wildlife management areas will pay the price. If you extended this rate of retirements for across DEEP's Environmental Protection Division to state parks, that would mean that about 37 out of 83 state park full-time workers may retire. On one hand, this speaks to the importance of members of friends groups like you, who will be the volunteers who will help keep state parks and forests going. But at the same time, you know that there are many things that park supervisors and maintainers do that volunteers cannot or should not do. This retirement cliff crisis has been foreseen since 2017, when the last 5-year state employee contract was negotiated. But we literally cannot wait any longer for the state to respond. It is urgent now. But I should say too, this is not a mystery to anyone. Aware of this impending crisis, the Lamont administration commissioned a report known as the CREATES report that identified several issues associated with the retirement cliff that DEEP and other state agencies have to work through. Specifically, they identified in that report, in addition to the massive number of impending retirements that I mentioned, a few key issues. The current non-competitive hourly rate for seasonal workers, currently capped at $14 an hour, is hampering DEEP's ability to recruit seasonals who are so critical to keep parks well-maintained and safe during each outdoor recreation season. DEEP is also falling short at retaining young resource professionals who may join the agency for just a few years and then leave for private sector opportunities. And then two other things. The loss of staff to retirements and departure is compounded by a long and challenging process to refill staff vacancies. And I should say that within the Parks Division, their existing staff, their current staff, have been heroic in trying to move things as quickly as possible. However, there are some great challenges for having just not enough people and not enough support from other parts of state government. And the CREATES report doesn't include this recommendation, but Eileen certainly hinted at this, and I'll say that having only 83 full-time employees, that's the current cap for the State Parks Division, and includes Hartford staff, to take care of 110 state parks, as well as campgrounds and park infrastructure, is truly absurd. Now, I'm not sharing all of this to depress you tonight. You were good enough to spend some time with us, but I hope you'll be motivated to take action with CFPA and the Friends of Connecticut State Parks, who will be strengthened in advocating for state parks with your involvement. The current combination of inadequate full-time employees, non-competitive hourly rates for seasonal workers, massive impending retirements, underwhelming retention of young resource professionals, and a cumbersome position refill process will unfortunately result in a disastrous 2022 state park season for the public if these resource issues are not addressed by Governor Lamont, his budget office, and our friends at DEEP. So let's make sure that that happens. There are lots of things that we can do together, and I look forward to the challenge. It will be a challenge for all of us, but there's no better fight to fight. So thank you all for being a part of the Friends of Connecticut State Parks, and we look forward to working with you over this next critical year. And I will just say with that big lead in to talk about some of the challenges that the state parks are facing, I do want to recognize and invite Tom Tyler, the State Parks Director, to share some words with you. He has been a terrific ally and advocate for state parks. I know that he's doing some incredible work under trying circumstances, and we appreciate his partnership very much. But Tom Tyler, would you share a few words?
Great. Thank you, Eric, and thank you to all for having me. It was a good thing I was on mute there, because during the last three speakers, I was furiously crossing things off my list here to speak about, because they were taking most of my speaking points. So as I run through this, it may be a little disjointed, but you can just imagine how well put together this would have been had these guys not stolen all my bullets. But again, I do appreciate you guys having me, and certainly. I quit that, speaking to friends groups, you have to remind yourself to start by thanking everybody and finish by thanking everybody. And I certainly want to do that on a number of points. But I do want to kind of recap the last year a little bit. And again, Pam and Eileen and Eric have hit a number of the important pieces, but let me throw in a few more details to help flesh that out a little bit. We certainly are coming off of another very trying year after a trying year. Before that, we continue to see record crowds at our parks, and in the context of some pretty frequently changing rules in terms of how we manage our facilities, and rules for the public operating on our lands and our buildings. From the very first days of the pandemic, we saw the beginnings of the double-digit annual growth that we have seen in attendance over the past 2 years. We recently wrapped up our the estimation efforts that we go through on attendance at seasonal at state parks. And we estimate now this past fiscal year, getting upwards of 13 million annual visitors at our state parks. That's up from just under 10 million just a couple of years ago. So the trend continues in terms of more folks coming out, which is great. But as Eileen indicated, all those additional bodies and feet are additional wear and tear, and efforts by staff to keep folks safe and enjoying the resources that they come out for. So those challenges continue. As you heard, we continue to be really at our lowest level of full-time employees and really in the agency's history, and continue to be challenged by a very significant lack of capital resources for infrastructure. There certainly are efforts both internally and certainly with advocacy groups, which we strongly we so appreciate the efforts to really look to kind of turn the curve on those negative trends, to provide the support that we need to our field staff, as well as the resources we all need to keep our facilities in a way that the public expects. So we do have, as mentioned, we do have increasing challenges with our ability to attract and retain seasonal employees who are so important to our operations, both increasing salaries and lack of flexibility on the salaries that we can pay, as well as just increasing competition and concerns about COVID. All those things continue to challenge us to bring folks on. One thing I would mention about some efforts and some modest success we've had this year, and a plea for additional help on your part, is our continued but also really renewed focus on looking at the diversity of the staff that we have. What's absolutely true about our workforce, both our full-time and seasonal staff, is we don't reflect the makeup of our state of Connecticut or the folks who visit our parks. And we want to continue our efforts to further diversify our staff. We've had some modest success this last year, actually, from a percentage basis. We actually had great increase, but when you're talking about such small numbers, a big percentage increase is not large in real numbers, but the trend is in the right direction, and we're going to continue to focus on that. Of course, we're challenged that a lot of our operations are in very rural settings, and often a great distance from communities with greater percentages of people of color. But we just urge everybody out there, just in terms of, because it's going to take all of our efforts, and just in terms of kind of networking on this issue, just urge folks, folks in your communities who may be a candidate for us, whether it's for a seasonal position or somebody who might come out and enjoy the work and get comfortable with it. Please let us know that. So I also just want to take the opportunity to thank all of our full-time and seasonal staff, as both Eric and Eileen indicated. That's really where the rubber meets the road for us. They've done just such yeoman work over the past year and a half to continue to keep our facilities open for the public. I know Eric spent some time talking about the cliff coming in 2022. I won't talk more about that, although I will just mention yesterday I was talking with a supervisor who actually isn't eligible for regular retirement yesterday. He just told me that he is planning on retiring. So those percentages of employees that can retire don't include some people who are going to retire. We're still hoping there's a number of people who are eligible who won't take advantage quite yet, and those numbers won't be quite as high as potentially they could be. I also wanted to mention on a point that Eileen make about the flexibility that's necessary from friends groups, and really just add my voice to that. I know I've had a lot of conversations with a lot of different friends groups this year about your events or efforts you're trying to support that needed to be curtailed or changed in some way, and I know that was challenging for a lot of you, but I just wanted to personally thank you all for your continued willingness to try and move forward with all those important efforts, but also your flexibility and recognizing that we haven't been able to host things the way we would have liked to in the past, and hopefully we will see some changes to that. I know I was just supposed to speak for a couple of minutes. I'll just end on one thing. I was just thinking about the other day I was actually in a conversation with somebody about an issue from years ago at the Capitol that reminded me of a couple of issues about, kind of being thankful for the things, that have been, delivered and exist because of your advocacy. And I always want to make sure I'm thanking folks for your effort and your continued effort on both the creation and the advocacy for the Passport to the Parks. It has its challenges. It continues to be threatened, but it has provided to us a stable, for the first time, really a stable funding source that allows at least our basic operations to continue, and that's because of your advocacy. So that's something that we can see, and I see daily in budgets the outcome of that. But I was reminded the other day of an issue of something that I'm grateful for that you don't see, and it's the absence of something. It's the absence of the annual conveyance bill. I was talking with somebody the other day about a real challenge that came up a number of years ago on the conveyance bill, and I was thinking to myself that during the heat of a legislative session, when you're dealing with a bunch of issues, you're not appreciative of the fact that you're also not dealing with the conveyance bill and all of its challenges. So I just wanted to, and that exists, that constitutional amendment that passed because of all of your guys' great effort. That I think has been so important, but maybe not in a visible way, because it's something that it's the absence of bad instead of the presence of good. But I was thinking about that the other day. I just wanted to make sure I mentioned that as well, that is something that continues to bear fruit for all of us and protect the lands we're charged with providing to our citizens. So again, I just want to take a couple of minutes to provide that quick update, and thank you all again for all of your ongoing support, and know that our appreciation for those efforts continue from all of us at DEP, from the commissioner on down. So thank you again for the opportunity.
So this is Susan Whalen. It's my pleasure to introduce the main event. I'm a proud member of the Connecticut Friends of State Parks, and I'm really delighted to introduce Dr. Nicholas F. Bellantoni, who's going to be our speaker tonight. Just a few housekeeping items. We are certainly going to be having a question and answer session at the end. So please use either the chat or the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen if you have a question for Dr. Bellantoni. So Dr. Nicholas F. Bellantoni serves as the Emeritus State Archaeologist with the Connecticut State Museum of Natural History at the University of Connecticut. He received his doctorate in anthropology from UConn in 1987 and was shortly thereafter appointed state archaeologist. He also serves as an adjunct associate research professor in the Department of Anthropology at UConn and is a former president of the Archaeological Society of Connecticut and the National Association of State Archaeologists. So thank you very much for being with us tonight. I'm fascinated to hear your talk, and I know we all are. So without further ado, Dr. Bellantoni.
Hey, thank you, Susan, and thank you everyone for tuning in with us and attending this meeting. I want to just say how important it is for all the work you guys do, not only as state employees, but certainly as part of the friends groups for the state parks and the forests, because what you do, you may not even be aware of it. You think of the recreational ends and the environmental aspects of these beautiful state parks, but all of them, I can tell you, all of them have significant archaeological sites associated with them. Hammonasset has Native American sites, as do many others. In fact, when I was an undergraduate back in the mid-1970s, I am that old, that I cut my teeth excavating at Fort Griswold State Park within the barracks area. So I can't stress enough the importance of what you do, and to say thank you all for what you do, because you are saving and working with the state parks, not only natural resources and recreational resources, but historical and archaeological resources. So thank you again. So what I'm going to do now is, I guess I get to share my screen. And if you could see that, I'm going to move things over and see if I can get my slide program up. And we'll start with that. Everyone sees that? That's good. Excellent. Thanks, Eric. Okay, so, we were asked if we would speak about the Farmington Mastodon, and we call it also the Pope Farmington Mastodon, because it was found on the Hillstead property, which was the property of Alfred Pope back at the turn of the century. So this is probably the most complete mastodon fossils, if you will, ever recovered from the state of Connecticut. So it's an important fossil and has a great little story attached to it. Before I tell you that, though, I want to give a shout out to my fellow state archaeologist, and Brian Jones. Many of you may know that Brian was a state archaeologist who replaced me when I retired. Sadly, he passed away 2 years ago. But Brian, one of his research goals and specialties, I should say, was the Paleo-Indian period. That is the earliest, peopling we have of the state of Connecticut over 12,000 years ago. And because his focus was on that very much, he was very interested in the Pope Mastodon from Farmington. And it was through him that the Mastodon was actually radiocarbon dated. And I will talk a little bit about that later on. And Sarah Sportman, who is our current state archaeologist up at the University of Connecticut with the Museum of Natural History. Her specialty is zooarchaeology, which means the study of animal remains from archaeological context. So she too has taken a real great interest in this particular specimen. So just a shout out to both of them, because they have continued the work on all of this. So, the mastodon, it's a wonderful, large post-Pleistocene, one of the megafauna that occupied the area once the glaciers had been removed. The Wisconsin glaciation was the last real advance of the Ice Age. The Ice Age, by the way, lasted 2 million years, but it was a series of advances and retreats. And the last advance was the Wisconsin, we call it the Wisconsin glaciation. It starts to melt about 18,000 years ago, and Connecticut becomes ice-free around 15,000 years ago. And it's very shortly after that we start seeing, or maybe even earlier, these megafauna coming in, and certainly the mastodon as one of those. So it was found on the property of Alfred Pope, who was an American industrialist. He was actually involved in the iron business. He owned iron foundries, and he came up with a new way of forming iron through what's called a malleable iron. And this was very helpful once urbanization occurred and skyscrapers and so forth. So obviously he became very wealthy, and he was an avid art collector. And he lived at the Hillstead in Farmington. That was his house. And later on, after the family, after he died, and the family would give the Hillstead as a museum. It's an art museum, but it's also a place where we have this wonderful paleontological find of the mastodon. And the way they tell the story of how this all happened, it was in August of 1913. And they were putting in, actually, they were digging out a trench to lay pipes to basically drain a swampy area. And when they did, the way they tell it is that a group of Italian workers who were doing the labor of digging the trench by hand found this black devil in the ground. And basically what it was would be the skull, if you will, the cranium of the mastodon. It was a kind of a dark chocolate texture to the coloration of the bone. And I love these Italian workers, you know, these are my gumbaris. These are the guys that, you know, my ancestors who I still dig trenches, but I do it, I guess, in a scientific way. I'm not quite sure. But they always refer to as the Italian workers who discovered it. They actually thought it was a tree root when they first hit the bones, and actually started to pull some of them out and tried to cut it. But they realized that maybe this was something different. One of their supervisors came over and, you know, was kind of recognized this was something unusual, went to the Polk family, and they were the ones that contacted Yale University to come down and start examining this, identifying it, and actually do the excavations to collect it. So when this hit in August of 1913, it became huge news everywhere. This was kind of like it appeared in all the newspapers. There were quite a fascination. And in fact, not only were getting all this attention and publicity, but people were actually coming out to watch the excavations. And you could see some of the planks put here over the wooden planks over the wetland areas, and people just coming to watch and see this black devil of a mastodon that was now being uncovered by Yale University. When they called Yale in, they sent two paleontologists up to Farmington, Charles Schoner and Richard Lowe, who would eventually write the next year an article on it for the American Journal of Science, in which they give a full description of the specimen and the find site itself. They worked out there for 2 weeks excavating, and they described it's an interesting way they described the stratigraphy. You know, it was basically a waterlogged area. The upper layers were very wet and, you know, had peat involved, and down below that there was clay, and then what they called a boulder clay, which I'm not quite sure I understand what that was, other than maybe there must have been a lot of sandy, gritty gravel also mixed in with it. And it's in that boulder clay at 30 to 48 inches low that they actually got the mastodon remains. And underneath that was, of course, glacial till. The researchers identified it as an adult male of a specimen. Now, clearly it was an adult because all of the long bones are properly fused. Whether it was a male or not is questionable, but it may well likely have been. It probably stood about 13 or so feet high at the shoulder. And we have these wonderful historical photographs of it. This is the workers showing the Yale researchers the discovery. And if you notice the names at the bottom, Gibb, Darby, Benton, Boswick, Cook, none of those sound Italian to me, but I guess they were Italian workers there. I'm not quite sure. But these are wonderful historic photographs, and many of them taken by Yale University at the time. You could see the mandible, the jawbone on the right there, and the rugged teeth. This was a real browser of an animal. We'll talk a little bit about that. And here it gives you a sense of the size. You've got the worker on the left is holding a femur bone, which is your thigh bone. And if you can compare it with his thigh bone, it's quite a difference. And of course, the jawbone just sits on top of the barrel there. Large individual. And here's another worker on the left with the lower arm bones, if you will, or lower forelegs, I should say, the radius and the ulna, and of course the upper foreleg with the humerus. So you can see the humerus is almost the size of the person on the right's torso. And so how they got these out, by the way, is, what they did is, especially the skull, because the skull was a little bit fragile, but to get it out and keep it in place, they wrapped it in plaster of Paris. And then were able to transport that to Yale University, where they then started to excavate the plaster to reveal the skeleton. This is a technique that's been used in paleontology for a long, long time. The interesting thing about this fossil, by the way, is it's not a fossil. Did I just contradict myself? It never fossilized. It's still bone, and it still has flaking and so forth. So it never completely mineralized in the soil, which is really interesting. So maybe it didn't have the time depth to transfer that mineralization into fossilization, but they treated it as a fossil and wrapped it in plaster of Paris. And then when they thought they were all done on Thanksgiving Day in 1913, so this is like 3 months later, they found the tusk of one of the tusks of the animal. And that was quite interesting because it was not with the original find. And if you look at this map, and if you could follow my cursor, here's a map of the finds. You can see where I'm circling here. This is the cranium, or the skull of the animal. This is basically the body bones, if you will, the vertebral column, some of the leg bones. Here is the pelvis. And actually from head to pelvis, it's about 10 feet in terms of how they laid, about 10 feet apart. Here, if you go to your lower left on the screen, where it says B, that's where the tusk was found. The tusk was about 23 feet away from the skull. Now, the researchers didn't know quite what to make of this. One of the theories was that this individual mastodon died and fell in the area, that carnivores may have come and dispersed some of the bones, including the tusk. Interestingly, this is about a 2/3 to 3/4 complete specimen. One of the things missing are the feet. All of the feet are missing. So whether those were gnawed off by carnivores to disperse somewhere else, whether they are still in the area, just like the tusk was found, they actually found that tusk by accident because they were doing a continuation of the drainage area, and that's when they hit upon it. So there's possibility that if those missing elements are still, they may still be on the site somewhere that did not receive the excavations on it. So whether that is what happened or whether there was human involvement here is a question we'll get into in a moment. All right, I'm having trouble advancing my slide. Let's see if I can do it this way. Okay, there we go. And this is, I love this picture because this is the truck, that was used to cart everything away and bring it back to New Haven, down to Yale. So what do we know about mastodons? Well, first of all, they inhabited forested swamps, and they had deep rutted teeth, which means they chewed, everything from roots to branches, twigs. They differ from mammoths, and I wanted to make this distinction clear because the term mammoth is usually more, more commonly referred to these elephant-like post-Pleistocene mammals. The differences between the two are very distinct, actually. Genetically, mastodons are a distant relative of modern elephants, and mammoths are far more closely related to what we have on the earth today. Again, the mammoths primarily occupy the eastern forest habitat. Again, they love to browse. Their teeth, if you look at the teeth in the upper left, they're very pitted, and they have high ridges, and this was perfect for browsing and cutting to consume woody sticks, twigs, brush, and so forth. The mammoths basically had flat teeth. You could see that up in the right-hand corner. and it was mostly of a grinding surface, a flatter grinding surface, because basically they grazed on grass within the tundra environment. Mastodons are distinct too because of the shape of their skulls. They have a flatter head and a straight tusk, whereas mammoths have a high domed head with a kind of a knob on the top of it, which is just basically a protrusion of bone, but they also have highly curved tusks. And when you see the two distributions, they did overlap, but primarily mastodons are found in the eastern forest habitat in the post-Pleistocene, where mammoths are primarily the western open grassland. But if you look at the red dots are mastodons, not Republicans here, and the blues are mammoths, not Democrats. But if you look at it, these are not red and blue states. These are actually finds where mastodon and mammoth remains have been found. And if you could see, you've got a real distinction with the Mississippi Valley to the east are mostly mastodons. But look, we've got mammoth bones in Maine, and while mastodons are primarily to the east, and we even have mastodon remains up in California. So they overlapped considerably, but very distinct when you do the quantification of the find spots. And I got Hot Springs, South Dakota here, because that's a famous mammoth a fossil area that I got to visit many years ago when I went to South Dakota to visit my friends at the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation out there, which is not very far from it. But there was overlap in their distribution, but primarily they occupied two different kind of ecological niches because of the kind of food that they were taking in. They didn't compete with each other. So when we look at that late glacial climatic period, it was basically what was going on here was a spruce pine forest, with birch and adler, lesser quantities of poplar and larch and fir. Oak really doesn't come in. He's got a little bit of oak back this time period, but about 10,000 years ago is when we really start seeing more oak coming in. There's very little left on the planet today for this kind of a ecozone. But note that, we not only had mastodons here, we also had a lot of other large mammals like short-faced bears and dire wolves. Mammoths were clearly here, though we have no fossil remains of them in Connecticut. Stag moose, giant beaver were here, ground sloths, musk ox, and certainly herds and herds of caribou, reindeer came up our river valleys back then. Herds in the hundreds and hundreds of animals. So it was a different climate than you and I think, and it was a different land because during that post-glacial period, the sea levels were a lot lower. And of course, with the melting of the glaciers, sea levels would rise and come back to where they are today. And of course, unfortunately, with climate change, we're seeing glaciers continuing to melt and sea levels continuing to rise. But when the mastodon were here, this was Connecticut had become ice-free. You see the ice boundary here in white. There were glacial lakes, Albany and New York. The only remnant of that left is Lake Champlain. Glacial Lake Hitchcock, which really encompassed the entire Connecticut River Valley from Middletown northward. By this time, we see it up further. And then Glacial Lake, Connecticut. I like to tell the folks around the coast that, that Long Island Sound started as a glacial lake. It did not start as a saltwater sound. It wasn't until the sea levels rose high enough through time that the lake was inundated in its eastern portion where we have the islands today, and then becomes salt water. But mastodons were here, that was fresh water. And actually, when the first people that came into Connecticut was water. But look at that, I want you to look at this landmass, this green. This is all, this would have been all landmass out here in the Atlantic Ocean, which is today the Atlantic Ocean, okay? Because that was a grand coastal plain, which a lot of these animals would transverse. And I tell you that because And here, of course, you could see where the Pope mastodon was. I tell you that because I had an interesting happen to me about 20 years ago, I guess it's now. And that is that a fisherman, a guy fishing outside of Long Island in the Atlantic Ocean, he's dredging, you know, it's a commercial fisherman. He's dredging, he pulls up his nets, and along with a bounty of fish, he also finds this rugged thing with roots in it. It had peaks in it and these dark roots, and he had no idea what it was. He called me up at UConn. I said, well, bring it up if you can, and I'll, you know, see if we could identify it. And when he brought it up, I explained to him that it was a tooth of a mastodon, an elephant-like creature during the Pleistocene. And he looked at me and his jaw dropped and he said, what's the elephant doing in the ocean? And I had to explain to him that that was an ocean, that was dry land, and mastodons roamed that area before the sea levels rose and completely inundated it. So, you know, when we deal with this kind of time frame, you know, we don't assume what we see out our windows today is what we saw back then. It was a completely different world than what we have today. The warming conditions come in, eventually the Holocene, and of course, we are still in the middle of a global Holocene. So one of the things we also wanted to look at was other mastodon finds here in Connecticut. And actually there have been a few. There was one up in Sharon in the 1828. We do not know very much at all about this. There are no real records other than a reference to it having been dug up. In Cheshire in 1828, same year, by the way, right, as the Sharon find, they were digging the Farmington Canal. If you know, before railroads came in, and with the success of the Erie Canal in New York, it was desirable for businessmen to be able to move their cargo from Massachusetts, if you will, all the way down to New Haven and then back up again from the New Haven seaport. There was difficulty of getting to Massachusetts on the Connecticut River because of the Enfield Rapids. So to build a canal that went all the way down there was, you know, that transversed Farmington and other towns was very much in demand. Of course, the railroad put them out of business pretty soon. And today, that Farmington Canal, as you know, is part of a Rails to Trails and wonderful resource for the people in the state of Connecticut. But they found evidently 3 or 4 molars when they were digging the canal. And the molars were not in very, very good shape. We really do not know what happened to those remains, by the way. We don't know where they are today. In New Britain in 1833, a few years later, another canal was being built. This one was for, I think it was a New Britain Biscuit Company or something like that, but they were building a canal to channel water to their factory when they hit a vertebra of a mastodon. And then in 1852, another mastodon was found near where today the New Britain YMCA is located. And this was far more complete. At least it had ribs, teeth. It had some limb bones from both forelimbs and hind limbs. And it was radiocarbon dated only about 6 years ago. It came out to a calibrated date of 13,100 to 12,984. So radiocarbon dates always give you a kind of a leeway. They're also called AMS dates that we have. When we say it's BP, by the way, means before present. So you could take it to be 13 to 12,000 years old. Calibrated is because rates of carbon in the atmosphere change. So they have to be, the dates have to be calibrated to be more in line of what the actual dating is. So an AMS date was done on the Pope mastodon. Again, Brian Jones saw to this. And what they did is they took some fragments from the tusk that were already kind of exfoliating. And when it came back, a conventional radiocarbon date came back to 12,400 plus or minus 40 years. There's always a standard deviation associated. But when you calibrate that, it looks like it's even older, 14,900 to 14,200 years ago. And if that's the case, again, you can see the YMCA mastodon in New Britain is a little bit younger. And this is a sample that they took from the tusk, they polish it down to process it for the dating. Just kind of the standard deviation of the dates here. But here's what I really want to show you. And you can see here the range of dates. If you look at the top of our chart here, you have the Pope mastodon. And when you see it down here, now you're talking 14,500 years ago. When you look at others that have been found in New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, it is the oldest one that we have. If you come down here, you see the New Britain mastodon. This is the one we just talked about. It is more closely to 13,000 years ago. So there's a range of variation of about 2,000 to 3,000 years. Now, these are the ones that we have radiocarbon dates for. But the Pope mastodon, the Farmington mastodon, turns out to be maybe the earliest of the whole group of mastodons that have been recovered and dated to date. So it's a really an important one for many, many purposes. So one of the questions, how does this correspond now with the first human settlers into Connecticut? And could it be that the first Native Americans that came into Connecticut interacted with mastodons and mammoths? Well, the earliest radiocarbon dated site we have is the Brian D. Jones site, yes, named after my colleague. And this is in Avon. This was discovered during a Department of Transportation project to rebuild the bridge over the Farmington River in Avon. And Brian, and I'll explain that a little bit further in a moment, but they named the site after Brian because probably without him, we would have never have found it. There's a Templeton site. You can see that one in the western part of the state. This is in Washington Depot, Connecticut, along the Chepaug River. It dates to, it's got a radiocarbon date of 12,000 years ago. Brian Jones, 12,500. These are the two earliest radiocarbon date sites we have in the state of Connecticut. They fit well with some of the other dates in New England. There are earlier dates, the Tennant Swamp site in New Hampshire and the Shawnee-Minnesink site in Pennsylvania have been radiocarbon dated just earlier than the Brian Jones site at 12,800. So when you look at that overlap of those radiocarbon dates of the mastodons and the radiocarbon dates for human occupation, well, you could see that it's very possible they were in the same environment together, occupying the Northeast. So did people in New England coexist with mastodons and mammoths? Well, what we know about those people that first came in here, we call them the Paleo-Indian because of the fact that they are the ancestors of the contemporary Native Americans, and Paleo meaning old, the oldest. They came in after the Wisconsin glaciation, as I mentioned, over 12,000 and maybe even 13,000 years ago. They were in small nomadic groups, probably 3 or 4 families, working together, following herds of caribou and, hunting along major river valleys and coasts where former lakes are. In fact, if I can go back to that map, if you look at going back to this map, here's the Farmington River, here's the Connecticut River, here's the Housatonic River, here's the Thames, and so what we're seeing is they're coming into the state, and they seem to be, even though branching out, they are going along river valleys, and it could be that these are where the caribou are roaming and others. So when they came here, the environment was barren. It was a landscape after glaciation. You saw some of that, spruce park tundra that we talked about. Gradually, it fills in with plants and animals, and as a result, makes it more viable for humans to live on the landscape. But the climate was obviously much more colder and much variable, and of course, lower sea levels. There's very good reason to believe that, there are sites that are now submerged by the Atlantic Ocean and the rising of the sea levels that were possibly earlier Native American origin. And they brought with them, this wonderful toolkit of stone tools that were, they sought out the finest grain implements, cherts and jaspers that come from quarries extensively, not just quarries that we don't even have in Connecticut, but such tools have been found in Connecticut. We call these fluted points. They were put on the ends of spears, fluted because you could see this channel that was cut out, and the stone was kind of hafted up to the shaft of the spear, and was probably thrown with an atlatl or a spear thrower. And if you look at the distribution of some of these sites in the Northeast, some of them are far away from some of the quarries. They traveled long distances, maybe because of following herds and so forth, but they're traveling long distances and they're searching out specific stone that would work within their toolkit. Very fine grained stuff. We don't have that here in Connecticut. Quartz is, we see a lot of points, projectile points made out of quartz. Quartz is chunky, it's hard, but it's so hard to work. But cherts and jaspers are fine. The Brian Jones site, I just want to just another shout out to my colleague. We miss him dearly. When the archaeologists came in to do the cultural resource management for the bridge site along the Farmington River and Avon, they found Native American artifacts, but artifacts that dated, maybe 6,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago. But Brian, because of his expertise in the Paleo period, just the way the land looked to him, he decided he wanted the area stripped. 5 feet of dirt, if you will, or soil was stripped away. And when they stripped it away, underneath is really when they found this wonderful site that not only included a series of artifacts, including scrapers and engravers, bifast faces, channel flakes, fluted point, but also features, the features that had botanical remains involved with it, that we could help reconstruct their food patterns and get good radiocarbon and AMS dates, accelerator dates, and discrete activity areas. And I tell you, I got to tell you something, guys. If I was a state archaeologist, then I wouldn't have gone down 5 feet. But Brian had the wherewithal to let's do it, and has found one of the most remarkable sites in the state of Connecticut. And kudos to him and his memory. And again, here's that picture I showed before. Here's the Brian Jones site, not far from the Mastodon site at all. And of course, with other fine sites of fluted points and other paleo artifacts of that time period. So one of the things about the Paleo Indian, maybe we emphasize this hunting business because, we've got these large game animals in the post-Pleistocene, and we have this toolkit that is sharp stones that were used for hunting and so forth. But you have to understand that what we're learning from the Brian Jones site and others is that they were very flexible in terms of their adaptation to the environment and the plant and animal resources that they were exploiting. It could be that a lot of those kind of materials do not preserve in the ground. You get what you get, which makes it really most remarkable for the Brian Jones site. But if anything, they were opportunistic hunters, gatherers, fishers. We don't know much about their settlement shelters. We know nothing about their burials. But we do know more about the plants and animals that they were exploiting, and that helps us. So, did they hunt megafauna? Well, in New England, we don't have any clear archaeological evidence for this. That is to say, we don't have mastodon bones like at Farmington with stone tools associated with them, okay? We do have that, however, elsewhere in Native American North America. And that is to say, there are other documented sites. The site here that we highlight, shows a mammoth rib from the Manus site in Washington. It was radiocarbon dated at 13,800 years ago. And there's a spear point actually made from a mastodon bone. So they may have been using the bones of these large animals to fashion their tools that were not fashioned by stone. And here you see you've got a spear point embedded in the rib of in this case, a mammoth, I'm sorry, a mammoth. So we do have evidence of this in elsewhere place in Indian North America. So the reasons that the Pope Farmington mastodon could not have been killed, butchered by humans is that, well, it predates the earliest archaeological site in the Northeast by 1,700 years. However, it's only as good as the archaeological record. And one of the things I try to emphasize to our students is that, you know, as new sites are discovered, new opportunities, and maybe pushing that date back. But right now, we could say that the mastodon in Farmington predates by at least 1,700 years, human coming into Connecticut. And there were no artifacts found with the mastodon. Now, one of my concerns was, you know, maybe the way they excavated, but Yale did a fairly complete excavation. And if you read the report, they actually worked with their Italian workers. They would help them with the excavation. And they actually talk about working with their hands to clear the clay around the bones so that they can get a recovery without damaging the specimen as much as possible. So, you know, we have to trust that they did a pretty good job. And also the bones are mostly complete. We don't have butcher bones. Now, some places where we do have mastodons and mammoths in North America, where Native Americans did butcher them and use them for food and hide and tools. We do see breakage. We see long bone breakage to get at marrow inside the cavity of the long bones, but we don't see that here. There's very little breakage in Farmington. And several scientists and research groups have worked on this mastodon, but nobody has ever observed any evidence of butcher marks. Well, maybe until now. We have looking at this, kind of resurrecting this particular fossil. Michael Rogers, an archaeologist at Southern Connecticut State University in the anthropology department there, took a look at some of the rib bones of the Farmington mastodon. And if you could follow my cursor, you could see there are some kind of striations going across here. Here's another picture, more clear striations. Now, the question is, could these have been done by stone tools, which would make it a very kind of secondary evidence, but it's possible. However, again, when you look at the way it was excavated and the completeness of the remains, there could be other answers for those what look like abrasions or cut marks. So, for example, sedimentary abrasion, grinding on the fossils as soil develops and so forth, you know, can mimic tool marks. Trampling, if there were other animals in the area, especially large megafauna, walking over this animal that had died and was laying in this swampy area, if they trampled him, they could have also mimicked cut marks. And when they prepared this fossil, as they cleaned it of its, you know, plaster of Paris, could they have put marks on it? And could the excavators have put marks on it? So it doesn't look like it, but it's not out of the realm of possibility, because we do have that elsewhere again in Indian North America. We do know that the earliest sites we have now are pushing that date of human occupation in North America further and further back. The Cooper's Ferry site in Idaho is now dated at 16,000 years ago. We have Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania that's radiocarbon dated to 16,000 years ago. So we know native peoples are here. And of course, we have good evidence for mastodon butchering in Washington, Missouri, as well as in other states. So it's possible, but we don't have the direct evidence yet. And until we do that interaction here in Antarctica. One archaeologist put it this way. He said, you know, if a Native American had ever saw a mastodon, they'd probably never stop talking about it. And that's probably true, but they would have utilized that animal for all of the resources that it had available to it. The real hero to our story, by the way, is Theodore Pope Riddle, who was the wife of Alfred Pope. She attends Miss Porter's School in Farmington, which is still there today, by the way. And she decided to stay in Farmington, and that's when they purchased the Hillstead property. She's the first woman architect in Connecticut and New York, and she has a claim of fame of surviving the torpedoing of the Lusitania in 1915. She was one of the survivors. But she's the one that recognized the importance of this fossil and contacted Yale. She also designed, as it says on the bottom, Avon Old Farm School. She's this was very important to her. When the publication was done, the bones came back to Hillstead, and she looked over them for a long time. In fact, they were in a barn on the property up until 1946. In 1951, Yale expresses an interest to reacquire the bones, which they do. But then evidently the bones show up in 1956 at Avon Old Farm School in the basement. So it had kind of a moving it around. And in 1971, the Connecticut Geological and Natural History Survey at Wesleyan and Yale, they collected up the bones, and I believe that's when they had it back at Yale. And then in 1979, where I first saw the mastodon, was at what was called then the Archaeological Institute for the American Indian. This was now the Institute for American Indian Studies today up in Washington Depot. They had an exhibit, and that exhibit is that I saw back in the late 70s and early 80s was the one pictured on the upper right here, where you can see the tusk coming down. So it was a wonderful exhibit. When the Connecticut State Museum of Natural History was developed at UConn, the mastodon was brought up to UConn then in 1989. It went back for an exhibit at the Institute for American Indian Studies. And now after that exhibit, it has returned to the University of Connecticut with the Connecticut State Museum of Natural History. And the goal is our friend and geologist Robert Thorson has been promoting, let's get that skeleton out of the closet. We have a lot of skeletons in closets, I guess, but these are the mastodons. And this one mastodon, it is in the collections of the Connecticut State Museum of Natural History. The goal for the museum is to reestablish a physical space. And with that, the mastodon will be one of the centerpieces of the new museum. So I sit on the board, and we're hoping to move forward with that in the very near future. And the mastodon will be a prize centerpiece on exhibit at that time. So I think that's my last slide I have. I'm going to stop sharing. And I believe Pam is going to now let me know if there are any questions. Happy to answer any ones I can.
Okay, there is a question submitted by Susan Whalen asking that since the mastodon bone was not fossilized, was there any ability to collect DNA from it?
No, you know what? I don't know that was even attempted. That's a really good suggestion. However, I will tell you that getting DNA from archaeological, or in this case, paleontological remains is really, unlike CSI, it doesn't always work. It's fraught with difficulties. However, the best shot we would have for DNA would be to take one of the molars, okay? Because the DNA is actually housed in the dentine, the pulp cavity inside the tooth. And what's really great about enamel, it's the hardest part of our bodies, it encompasses that pulp cavity to give you the hard grinding tooth that you have. And so what happens as a result of that, it helps to preserve longer the DNA that might not be in the actual bone tissue anymore. So, that has not happened, but you know what? Maybe that's one of the, I'll talk to Sarah. Maybe that should be something next on our research list.
And a question from Eric Hammerling wants to know who actually owns the bones. Is it the Hillstead or is it Yukon or some other entity?
No, actually, it's the way the law in the state of Connecticut works is anything you find on your property, it belongs to the property owner. Okay, so legally, Hillstead still has ownership of those remains. And right now they're housed at Yukon, but if they ever wanted to do an exhibit or have them returned, certainly they have that right. But the only thing you cannot own as a property owner is a human burial. Okay, human graves that's a special category that's not included, but you can't own human remains. But Mastodon, that's another. So yes, the Hillstead Museum would be the appropriate owner of the Mastodon. Actually, now I should tell you that the property that it was found on, while it was part of the Hillstead Pope property, is actually not part of the museum today. That property is not as large as it used to be.
Okay, I am not seeing any additional questions unless somebody else sees one that I have missed.
I was so clear that there can possibly be no questions.
You are always fascinating, Nick, and I'm getting, there are comments about what a wonderful talk this was and what a great presentation. And I concur, and I was very fortunate to be able to work with Nick over many, many years because the state parks and forests seem to have hundreds, if not thousands, of historic and archaeological sites on them.
Absolutely.
And Nick was our original call before you dig guy. So for any
That's
project
right.
we ever did, Nick got to see the site first. And some of those sites are, we never did build on them because they were so important and they are still hidden today. And some are a little more obvious, but he's been a great help to the state park and forest system. And many of our precious findings are protected because of that.
Absolutely. And thank you all for all you do for our state parks. Your work is truly important.
Okay, so not seeing any additional questions here. Again, I'd like to thank you, Nick, for your fascinating presentation and being so generous with your time and your knowledge. And thank you and our appreciation to all of you for taking the time to join us tonight. We wish you warm holidays, a very happy new year, and an exciting 2022 recreation season in all of your parks and forests. Good night, everybody.
Good night.